quite a lot of people set up these platforms, these peer-to-peer marketplaces, because they believe that the way that they can do business will change things and change the world. And I know that seems like a bold idea, but most entrepreneurs in this space have a mission and a sense of purpose in that way, and we want to help them.
This is Gigging, Everything in the Sharing Economy podcast, and I am your host, Mark Anthony Peterson. This is the podcast about the sharing, gig, and circular loop economy that is expected to grow to $335 billion by 2025. This is the podcast where founders, CEOs, market makers, and market leaders come to discuss the future of the sharing economy. We have a fascinating show for you today. We have an interview with Eleanor Tucker, the gang leader at Ganghut-Media. Eleanor is the founder of the very first sharing economy marketing agency. And in this interview, she shares many insights about how to launch and grow peer-to-peer marketplaces. By the way, this podcast is sponsored by Ceyero Consulting, a leading technology and business management consulting firm focusing on startups, small and family-owned businesses. Ceyero Consulting believes that an idea can launch a business, but a strategy can take it global. Find Ceyero Consulting at ceyero.com, Ceyero.com. One more thing before we get into the interview. Guess what, guys? I've launched a new startup, and it's called Ziskit. It's a grocery shopping platform where grocery stores bid to fulfill your shopping list. And I need your help. I need more customer discovery. Will you please go to my website, ziskit.shop, that's ZISCUIT.shop, and take my survey. I would greatly appreciate it. And now, guys, the interview with Eleanor Tucker, Ganghut-Media's gang leader. Welcome back to the podcast. We have a very exciting show for you today. We have Eleanor Tucker. She is the gang leader at Ganghut-Media. Eleanor is also a former journalist and an advertising media executive turned peer-to-peer marketing place obsessive. She is a freelance features writer for some of the world's most renowned media groups, such as The Guardian and the British Broadcasting Company. She co-founded Rude, the first communications company to focus on the sharing economy. As I mentioned, she is the director and gang leader at Ganghut-Media, the only marketing agency specializing in peer-to-peer platforms. Eleanor Tucker, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mark. Lovely to be here.
Before we jump in, please tell the audience a little bit more about you. I gave a bit about your professional career, but tell us more about the personal side of Eleanor Tucker.
The summary is interesting because it does sound like I've done quite a lot of different things, which I have. But I do sometimes feel that the paths that you take lead you into one direction, and it's not necessarily clear at the time what the direction that is. So although my career has been in advertising, I think the overall theme has been around writing, and lots of paths converged. And when I discovered the sharing economy, I think that they all sort of gelled into one. So we'll speak about that a bit. But I was born in Oxford, actually, in the south of England, but I now live in Scotland. My husband is from Edinburgh, so that's where I live with my family, 2 children and a stepdaughter as well. And I spend a lot of time on Google Hangouts, talking to people all around the world who are connected with the sharing economy and have built up relationships and many friendships and partnerships with people all around the globe who are, like me, fascinated with this new emerging way of doing business. So it's really exciting. And I, in a way, I don't really think of it as my work because I enjoy it so much.
I can understand that. The sharing economy has created a global community of sorts. When you think about the platforms that most people are familiar with, like Airbnb and Uber, people who didn't necessarily see themselves as entrepreneurs or solopreneurs are now in the market meeting people that they never would have come in contact with had they not opened their doors and their cars to individuals in order to make money.
I agree. And I think that it's the users of the platforms who are connecting to each other, but also the people who work in this space like you and I. So I think the beauty, in a way, of the sharing economy and the platform economy is that it unites people, whether it's just people using the platforms or it's people who like to talk about it and help these platforms to succeed. There's a connectivity in it, which I love, and a borderless ethos to the whole thing, which is why I'm talking to you from Edinburgh and you're in Atlanta. There does seem, it transcends, I think, a lot of the borders that previous businesses were confined by.
Right. Now, you mentioned that your past, journalism, led you to where you are today. How did you become the world's first sharing or gig economy marketing specialist?
Well, I don't think it's something anyone would have sort of sat up in bed in the morning and thought, do you know what I'm going to be? It's one of those things that evolved. And I think the first time I heard about the sharing economy was what prompted me to pitch an article, which I don't think was ever commissioned, but it was to the Guardian newspaper. I was writing very regularly for them. And I found out about this term and it fascinated me. And I think at that point, I felt that there was a sense of purpose to all the things that I'd done prior to that, to the advertising experience. I was a creative for an advertising agency, and that was my first kind of proper job. And after that, I moved into journalism because I loved the storytelling of journalism, but I also like sort of finding out about new trends and finding out and talking to people. So I suppose, in a sense, all that as well, without me knowing it at the time, was a precursor to the sharing economy. And when I pitched this article to the Guardian, which I don't think they took me up on. It was before anyone could even use the expression or the Airbnb for whatever it was, because people didn't even know necessarily what Airbnb was. So the sharing economy wasn't a widely used term. People didn't know what Airbnb was. So it was really niche, and I think particularly in the UK, not necessarily something that people would have understood or been interested in. But something pulled me in that direction. And I think and when you introduced me there, you talked about Rude, which was the PR agency I set up with my co-founder at the time, Eve. And we really put something together that was so specialist that most people didn't understand it. But we persevered and we attracted some really early stage sharing economy clients. So it was really a path that led to this, and so many steps upon the journey. I don't think there was any sort of particular moment where I would have said, oh gosh, I'm one of the world's first gig and sharing economy marketing specialists. I suppose it's just a sudden realization that people are coming to you and asking you about it, and you realize that not really many other people know about it, and that's when you realize that you're a specialist.
Let's set the table for the audience. What's the difference in marketing in the collaborative economy versus marketing in other areas?
Yeah, I think that's something that people ask quite a lot. And I think that many people would think that just marketing is just marketing. And I think that there are some really fundamental ways that it's different in this space. And I'd say that the first of those, and probably one of the most important, is the education piece here, because what we're asking people to do is to live their lives in a different way. We're asking them to access goods or access services in a way that they haven't before. So the analogy I often use is the old car adverts, the sort of classic VW adverts where all they had to do was put a picture of a VW car and it was brand awareness, but it was so simple and it was quite clear that they were getting you to buy that car. So you didn't really need to say much about that. It's you're buying into the brand. The car looks great. There's maybe a color that you would want. It's a really simple idea. But if you're getting people to engage in peer-to-peer car sharing, so encouraging them to either let their car be used by a neighbor or encouraging people to, instead of owning a car, to rent out one from someone nearby, you've really got to take them on a journey there. The marketing has to work so much harder. It really has to explain that process. I mean, how does that work? Where do you get the keys from? What if you crash the car? All these things that you have to get the marketing to explain the journey and take the potential customer on a path where you're holding their hand and overcoming their barriers. So it's a much more complex job that the marketing has to do. And part of that as well is the trust thing, because a lot of people are quite mistrustful of a peer-to-peer transaction. They don't necessarily trust, for some reason, the person along the street from them, whereas they would trust a big brand. And I think that's changing to a degree, but still people worry that they're going to get ripped off or, that there's a scam involved when they're dealing with another person rather than dealing with a company. And I think that probably the third way that this type of marketing differs is that you're not just a company selling a product to customers. You're a platform which connects two sets of people. So that marketing, again, becomes much more complex because the way that you talk to these different groups of people is massively different. If you think, for example, somebody is renting out a camper van for somebody else to use on a platform, the way that you speak to that person who owns the camper van to get them to upload their pictures of their camper van and to buy into this idea is going to be completely different to the way that you sell using the camper van to somebody. So it's this complex set of messages that you've got to get across, which is so different from traditional marketing where you're just saying, look at this great car, buy it. It's almost quite simplistic, really, when you look back and see the old style of marketing, the kind of classic just buy this thing style of marketing.
That makes sense, because when I think about Uber, for example, everything my parents taught me growing up was to leave Uber alone. They told me never get in a car with a stranger. Now, today, Uber is one of the biggest brands on the planet, and everyone is getting in a car with a stranger, as if it's always been a part of our cultural fabric. So you're absolutely right. Sharing economy marketing is a much more complex marketing approach to build a sustainable brand. Is that what Gang-Hut-Media specializes in? Is that your value proposition? Is the value you bring to platform startups is finding the brand message and helping them get traction?
Yeah. And I think our strapline, our kind of ethos is let's tell the world how your marketplace can change it. And, I still like saying that, even though we came up with it a while ago, because to me, it's not just about, I think, marketing for marketplaces or something like that. It's a bit prosaic. But what this does is explain that we want to help you to tell your story as a peer-to-peer marketplace. And quite a lot of people set up these platforms, these peer-to-peer marketplaces, because they believe that the way that they can do business will change things and change the world. And I know that seems like a bold idea, but most entrepreneurs in this space have a mission and a sense of purpose in that way. And we want to help them to tell their story. And then we realized when Rude was with the precursor to Ganghut, that it wasn't just about PR, and that was sort of one part of the puzzle, really. So that's why Ganghut evolved, because we wanted to offer all sorts of marketing consultancy so that we could help people along every step of the way. And that could be actually helping them to create their brand in the first place, and to create their name and their messaging, and then to help them to launch, or if they were a bit further along, to help them to maybe, I don't know, to pivot, or to adopt a platform model if they were an established company. So really just helping people to tell their story using the best methods that they could, really, and to help them to reach the right audiences in the right way. And it feels very purpose-driven in that sense. And that's something that keeps it fresh every day and makes me really passionate about it.
You mentioned that these brands want to change the world, to change commerce. How do you think these peer-to-peer platforms have actually changed commerce? And how do you think people view the future of work?
Well, I think that in the past, people have been all too ready, and I'm guilty of that myself, to kind of almost sort of, bow down at the altar of big business. And we trusted big companies, and they served us, and that's where we went for our goods and our services. But technology has enabled us to look not just up at the big businesses, but around us, and look to our peers. And all that is doing is opening up a way of doing business that has been around all along. But in the kind of post-industrial revolution, we just started to become served by big businesses, and we forgot that the way that we used to share and the way that we used to trade our goods and services. But technology has enabled us to do that again and connect with individuals around us. So I think that that's the way that the platform economy has the potential to change commerce, is by allowing us to connect with the people around us. And that has loads of different kinds of value. It's a more sustainable way of doing business, because quite often we're using assets that are there anyway and sharing them when they're lying unused. It allows people to access things that they might not have previously been able to. So it democratizes, in the sense that, say, for example, a boat sharing platform. It means that, a family could go on a yacht in the Mediterranean, when previously that would be the realm of multi-millionaires, So we have the chance to access goods and services that we wouldn't have necessarily been able to before. So the potential of this is huge, and the benefits are huge. So I think it has a real potential, and it is changing the way we think about the future of commerce and work as well, because we mustn't forget this is about services too. So it could have the potential to allow someone to share their skills when previously they wouldn't have been able to do that before, and to make a living from them in a way that they wouldn't have before through the gig economy.
What I love about it is the potential for individuals to have a personal brand, and to have that brand to be local. An individual can work from anywhere once they have established a brand, assuming they have a place to archive their work history. Once you have, you can sell your service anywhere on the planet. Under the old model, individuals were locked into local markets, and companies controlled all the messaging.
That's right.
One thing peer-to-peer marketplaces suffer from is the chicken and egg problem. And solving that problem for gig economy companies is a massive undertaking. How do you get companies on the platform before you get customers? How do you get customers on the platform when you don't have companies ready to provide their services or their products? Eleanor, what have you learned about how to solve the chicken and egg problem for two-sided marketplaces?
Well, I think it's important to say first that this is a different problem for every type of platform, because of the users and providers being really distinct groups of people. But what I've found, and what fascinates me, is that these users and providers, as we call them, can often be really two really distinct groups that have absolutely no overlap at all. And sometimes they can be practically the same kind of person. And that really has an effect on, as you say, the chicken and egg problem, which is obviously what you're saying is which side you build up first. So say, for example, I think a good example of that is you talked about Airbnb before, is that somebody who is predisposed to rent out their home on Airbnb would be highly likely to use Airbnb when they're traveling themselves. So they are a user and provider. And going back to the camper van analogy before I spoke about before, that's an example of a platform where it would be extremely unlikely that somebody who owned a camper van and was renting it out on a platform would rent out a camper van on a platform because they have one. And, so those two groups are unlikely to cross over. So that's always something to bear in mind, that the problem, the chicken and egg problem, is different for all platforms because the users and providers are often very distinct groups or with a huge crossover. So that does come into play. I would say normally what we would advise on a classic peer-to-peer platform is that if you build up your providers, your inventory on your site first, this will enable you to invite people to get involved in something and they're not expecting an immediate result from that. So whether they're listing their services on a gig economy site or they're listing their assets to be rented out on a sharing economy site, they're in it for the long game. And they understand that as a provider. So you're not saying to somebody, list your Italian tutoring skills on this gig economy site, and they'll be expecting to get their first student on that day. They understand that by perfecting their profile, that they might, actually create some revenue in the future, and they're willing to wait. Whereas if you start to attract users to your site, they will usually be looking on the site to see the range on offer, and because they have an immediate need. So if that isn't there for them, they probably won't look again, because in their head that site didn't have what they were after, and they would probably be likely to tell people that there wasn't the range on offer as well. So that could be really detrimental. So we would say normally build up that provider base first, explain to people that there are rewards in it, incentivize them registering, tell a story. Again, it's all about storytelling of what they can gain from being part of something as it's setting up. And then you can open the doors and let your users in, and everything is in place for them, because they're going to want that instant win when they come onto the site. But again, as I said, each platform is different, and you've got to think about those distinct groups, your user provider groups, and how they might cross over as well. Because it could be that you build up your providers and actually they are going to be users as well, which is great because they're already engaged. So in a way, in that sense, you're building up your users and providers kind of at the same time. You're just asking them to do one part of it first. So it's complex, but it's interesting.
That makes a lot of sense when you think about how Airbnb gained traction. They partnered with Craigslist, and they also used screen scraping technology to gather data on people who were already listing rooms for rent, to create that inventory that you mentioned of hosts, so that when users came to the site, they were already hosts willing to rent rooms because they were already doing it on another platform. So your approach makes sense. Get those quick wins so that users can start to tell your story, which is critical, as you mentioned, to establishing your brand.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that the biggest mistake you see entrepreneurs who are launching these two-sided marketplaces? Is that the biggest mistake they make by not trying to get these quick hits? Or do you see them making other bigger mistakes?
Well, I think one of the mistakes quite often is related to that. And it is when people just think in terms of having a customer in the old sense and not researching the two sides, and obviously some marketplaces have more than two sides, and not researching these types of people. So say, for example, and this applies to all types of marketing, and including the sort of the PR piece as well, which sits alongside it. Because you think about going back to boats, we talked there about the boat sharing. I worked with a boat sharing client, and what's really interesting is when people have a boat, a yacht, a sailing boat, they are really immersed in that world, and they're a part of a sailing community, and they often read sailing magazines and websites, really immersed in that world. Whereas somebody who wants to dip into that world and maybe take a family holiday, they're really not interested in becoming a sailor. They want to have that experience. And I think thinking of all of those people lumped into one as your customer, and thinking about your messaging and your media plan, what publications you might want to get into as you know, and be featured in the press. Thinking of that as a one bunch of people is a huge mistake, because these avatars, these customer avatars or profiles or whatever you like to call them, are so distinct there. So say, for example, your user there might be somebody like me with somebody with a family wants to take their kids on an exciting holiday. I don't want to be reading sailing magazines. I don't want to become an expert on that. I want to have an amazing experience. Whereas your boat owner really wants to be reassured that their boat is going to be all right with a family like me. So I think one of the mistakes we see happening is when people just lump everyone together and say that's our potential customer, because it's so much more complex than that. And just another quick sort of mistake that we see sometimes is people often have a really good idea, in inverted commas, for a platform. And they've thought of a lot of things, but they don't think about what problem it's solving. And if it's not solving a problem, it's not making a traditional way of doing something better in any way, then it really isn't going to go very far, because disruption is one thing, but disruption has to have a purpose. There has to be a pain point that you are coming to and you're addressing with this idea. And we've seen that a few times. And it's fair enough to have a gig economy platform, but if say, for example, something I came across recently was about driving instructors. We've got to understand why a platform for driving instructors would be better than making a call and booking your lesson, and also what sort of repeat business are you going to get? Because once you've passed your test, that's you. So you've got a very defined, tight group of people there. Is a platform that's specifically for that audience, is that going to work? Or do you maybe need to start more broadly and just have that as one part of it? So I think really thinking about the problem and what you're solving with your platform is one part of the research that people often miss out.
I've looked at a few sharing economy platforms in China, and I'm amazed at all the ideas that have proliferated in that country. Umbrella sharing, basketball sharing.
I saw the umbrella one. I'm like,
yeah, exactly. I was going,
But you're right. What problem are you solving when you set up a kiosk to share umbrellas? Are you planning to get the customers to return the umbrellas? If they don't, how does that affect the business model? Without going through that sort of analysis, you can quickly find yourself spinning into a doom loop. You're going to create more problems than you solve.
Yeah, I think a good checklist that I've read about before is the asset high value, and is it infrequently used? Because if it's infrequently used, it's lying idle, so therefore it's open to other people using it. One of the worst ideas I saw was makeup for the sharing economy. It's like, well, it's frequently used, fairly low value, and quite unhygienic to share. So you're really sort of not ticking any boxes there, and yet somebody persevered with that. And I don't think it succeeded, funnily enough.
I am glad that idea did not succeed. Speaking of these examples that we just ticked off, what differences do you see in the U.S. sharing economy versus the EU market when it comes to peer-to-peer market platforms?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think the US is obviously with Silicon Valley. You've always been ahead of the curve when it comes to the sharing economy. But I think one of the ways that I've noticed that the US is different is that because of the big distances that you have, it quite often is that a peer-to-peer platform is a statewide setup rather than one that covers the whole country. So say, for example, some of the car sharing platforms that we have in the UK might start in a couple of cities, but their ambitions are usually UK wide, and that will happen fairly quickly. Whereas often I will come across a sharing platform in the US, and it's really just in one state, and actually its ambitions aren't out with that state. And I know that you have different legislation in each state as well, which might make it hard to reach out across. And obviously some of the bigger platforms that have scaled are US wide. But for some, I find that it's interesting how you do stay in one state. And also I think the way that in the US people live their lives makes it slightly different, because I think because areas and distances are much larger and longer, you maybe are more likely to be in your car, for example. So that has an effect on the way that cities work, and the logistics of daily life are different as well. And when it comes to sharing and neighborhoods, that has an effect on how you can get an item to another person. So I think that's interesting. The practicalities of sharing are different, I think.
Where I see opportunity, it runs in the face of American culture, particularly around ownership. There's a platform in the UK that launched to share household items, kitchen appliances, weed eaters, lawnmowers. And when you think about most American suburban communities, that would be a great opportunity to launch a sharing model around the same concept. These items sit idle for 10 to 14 days out of the month. Why not share them with your neighbors and make a little additional income? Why spend $700 on a riding mower and only use it twice a month? And yet you don't see a national player in the U.S. yet that's supporting this sort of model. And I think it's because of the whole sense of ownership and the throwaway culture are still very much embedded in the American psyche. I find it also interesting that when you get outside the U.S. and the U.K., and look at places like China and the Philippines or Thailand, you get some unique models that are supported by the culture, which are more open to sharing because their perspective on assets, certain assets, that they can be community owned. These sorts of sharing platforms are catching on faster in these regions than in both the US or the UK.
Yeah, and I think the motivations of different regions for adopting sharing models is very interesting, because I think that there are some countries who adopt sharing models out of a necessity. Say, for example, their country's been in recession, or has been it's been an area of conflict, and they're trying to sort of democratize the way that they live their lives. I've worked with a group from the Balkans, and they have created sharing models just to help people to be able to access the same services. Whereas when you look at Silicon Valley, this is coming out of a tech mindset and innovation, it's obviously a lot of it is about making money, and so it's very different. And I think that culturally, and there's a hub in Australia as well. They're very interested in peer-to-peer marketplace in Australia, and I've worked with a few clients there, and they are also very innovative down there. But then Australia hasn't got a history of recession, so they're able to sort of play around and innovate a bit more than maybe countries who are adopting sharing models out of a necessity from an economic point of view.
Need-based innovation is certainly something that I am familiar with. Growing up in the rural South in Alabama, I saw many of the same ideas that you see emerging in China today as a part of the daily fabric in the Black community. Clothes sharing, for example. My father needed a suit for his college interview. Couldn't afford one, didn't have one. But he put the word out at church, and by that evening a gentleman about his same size showed up at the front door and gave him his suit and his shoes. That occurred over 55 years ago, before anyone was uttering sharing economy. Food sharing. In China, there's a startup called Home Cook, with a market cap of about $3 billion. They match business people who are tired of restaurant food with home cooks who will give them a meal, a home-cooked meal. Black women in the South, my grandmother included, would sell plates of food or desserts in order to make ends meet. The only difference between these two communities is that the Black community did not have the technology to monetize these sharing ideas at the time. So yeah, I agree with you that the need-based innovation produces similar solutions around the world. I also find it interesting that some of these models are starting to converge given the exogenous shocks we see to the system. The coronavirus, or the COVID-19, is stimulating individuals to consider these peer-to-peer platforms as they seek supplies and services that were in full supply before the pandemic.
And I think what's great about that story you've just chosen there about the suit and the clothes sharing, I think that's a really compelling message there that this idea, this concept of the sharing economy has always been there. And I think it's reassuring for people, especially maybe the older generation, to understand that this isn't some new, scary, trend. This is literally just an age-old way of doing something. The only part of it's different is that the technology makes it easier. And reaching out to your neighborhood to find a suit that fits you maybe is easier on an app, but at the same time, somebody's still going to bring that round to your door. And so the community that you've created via the platform or via the app might be virtual, but the real life community on the ground is the one that's coming together. And I think that's what is so empowering about this, is that it's reigniting communities that are on the ground via the technology that's in the air. And these communities might have been, moved apart a little bit, I suppose, in recent years. And this has the potential to unite them again.
That's exactly my message to aspiring entrepreneurs. Where you see the need, use technology to disrupt and monetize. These exogenous shocks, the COVID-19, may open up new opportunities. Eleanor, given your expertise, how do you think COVID-19 will impact the sharing economy, these peer-to-peer marketplaces? Because a lot more of us are stuck inside versus sharing those suits with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read, quite often the media are keen to jump on the sharing economy and make a good headline. She says, as an ex-journalist, make a good headline and say, oh, this is the end of the sharing economy. People don't want to share things because other people have touched it. I mean, that's just nonsense, isn't it? Because the reality is that there is a huge tranche of the population there who are downloading apps using technology in a way that they've never before. So suddenly people are doing things that they might not have done before. So the education piece and all these things that we've talked about before, and how people find it hard to adopt a different way of doing things, in a way, these people have been pushed off a cliff, because if they want to speak to their relatives, they've got to Zoom them. So suddenly people like my mom are downloading Skype, and that's a big step and a big sudden step. And if you are downloading an app to do something else, to do your shopping on, you might be interested in a sharing app if someone tells you about it. So I think this type of crisis where people are returning to their communities in a sense, and they're at home more, but they're also adopting new tech, actually couldn't be more perfect for the sharing economy. And obviously it's a crisis and people are losing their lives. So it's not, nobody's sitting cheering, but at the same time, it's a setting where these apps and platforms can grow in a way that maybe previously they hadn't thought that they could at such pace.
If you had to step back from the sharing economy, what do you see as other major disruptors to the continued growth of peer-to-peer models, other than the coronavirus? Because companies like Uber and Airbnb were flying into regulatory headwinds that were pushing back against their business models. Are there any other disruptors you see out there that might slow down the sharing economy?
Well, I think it's probably a lack of innovation, or businesses who are not keen to sort of adapt and move forward, and they in a way can block progress. But I think many large corporates now are looking at platform models as a way that they can either adapt their business or maybe adopt a platform model alongside their existing services. You look at a brand like IKEA, a global brand like IKEA, who not long ago adopted TaskRabbit, the gig economy app, to help people to put up their furniture. And obviously what they've done there is they've addressed a pain point, and they've used a gig economy app to solve that, which is very forward looking. And I think more and more businesses are going to do that. But the sticking point that stops some moving forward is I suppose a bit of tunnel vision on the part of some of the big corporates who maybe just see this as a fad. But I don't know. Maybe time will tell, and certainly some of the big the PwCs of this world have made predictions about the sharing economy that I think really need to make these big businesses sit up and take notice that there's a sea change.
I think that sea change is starting to take hold. Before COVID-19, I was amazed at how many corporations were embracing peer-to-peer platforms to support their business models and to improve their customer service experience. Home Depot partnering with Roadie to make same-day delivery of tools and parts. Delta Airlines using Roadie to drop off customer bags. Shipt partnering with CVS to deliver customer prescriptions. In a prior world, these things didn't happen, or if they did, it took more than 24 hours to get it to the customer. A real improvement in the customer service experience. And it's all because of these peer-to-peer platforms.
And they're seeing that on-demand technology, that really clever technology is there for the taking, whereas I think they maybe had been skeptical in the past, but now they're seeing people en masse adopting the likes of Uber and Airbnb, and they're thinking, let's have a piece of that action.
Right. Which helps their bottom line, and it activates more solopreneurs to participate in the economy in ways that fit their lifestyle. I'm 2 thumbs up on the future of the sharing economy. This has been great. If people want to continue this discussion with you, Eleanor, how do they connect with you, and how do they connect with Gang Hut Media?
Well, we're big social media fans, so our handle across everything is Gang Hut Media. So check us out or find me on LinkedIn. We work in a lot of different ways with a lot of startups and established platforms, helping them to either prepare for investment, help them with their marketing strategy. We will help brands with their messaging and their chicken and egg situation, and really, get to grips with their customer profiles and their audiences. We will also support you with media consultancy, helping you to, work out how you're going to get out and create a buzz in the press as well. So this is our world. And aside from Gang Hut, I also consult in this space and work with the Sharing Economy Global Summit and with Marketplace Risk, which is a platform based in the US. And so, lots of touch points there, really, for anyone wanting to get involved and find out more about this space.
We'll make sure we put all those links in the show notes so that everyone can find you and find Gang Hut Media. Eleanor Tucker, gang leader at Gang Hut Media, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Mark.
I want to thank Eleanor Tucker, director and gang leader at the UK-based Gang Hut Media, again for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed that discussion. What's next on Gigging News? We have some more exciting shows lined up for you. Tobias Perserud, director of the App Jobs Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, he's up next on Gigging News, and he and I nerd out as we talk about the future of work. I really enjoyed that episode as well. James Zimbardi, CEO of Rent Items. We talk about his peer-to-peer marketplace and how that's making communities better. And of course, don't forget Gigging News. We have more of those episodes coming up, and there are lots of new things to share with you about what's going on in the gig, sharing, and circular loop economies. If you like gigging, you may also like my other podcast, Guerrillapreneur, The Art of Waging Small Business Warfare. I will warn you, that podcast is for business mavericks, entrepreneurs, and disruptors. If you're not one of those, you don't have to go home, but I would advise you not to go up into that podcast. Thank you for listening, and let's continue the conversation. Follow us on Twitter at GiggingAnd. That's GiggingAnd. Till next time, guys, keep sharing, and peace.